Okay. I'm going to ask you just to keep the page with the free writing close by so that you can refer to that and even still maybe make notes for yourself as we go along. But nevertheless, I'd like to start the conversation. And really, for the purpose of this session, what I feel is important for us to look at are these questions that you see on the screen now. What should be the primary role of higher education teachers in terms of curriculum design and curriculum delivery? Are we perhaps prisoners of old ways of curriculum design and delivery, and therefore having difficulty breaking out of this mold because we've been trapped in this for so long? Is there a disparity between what we say and what we do? Because very often when you speak to staff will tell you, yes, it's really important to get active learning going, and I need to be student-centered, and I need to listen to my students, and I need to strengthen their voices in the classroom, all of that. But the reality is that when we look at what comes through to the curriculum development unit, very often in the HEQC templates, it's like a different world. So what we say and what we then do are sometimes two different things. And I think it's part of how do we address this issue. So therefore sometimes it looks to us as if we're trapped in a product-orientated conception or paradigm of curriculum where we're predominantly just looking at what are the actual requirements. So we get so fixed on the requirements of their national agencies and very often our professional bodies that all of our good intentions around teaching just kind of flies out the window when we sit with these templates in front of us. So it's really asking, therefore, the hard questions about what are we going to do about this and how are we going to break out of this mold. It's important for us, therefore, that to consider our conceptions of curriculum and our orientations towards curriculum because it has really serious implications for student learning and engagement. And as you could see for the curriculum design model that we've shown earlier, learning-centered curriculum was right in the center, the pivotal point of all of that. So this presentation is unpacking what does learning-centered curriculum actually then mean. So in order to do so, I thought it would be helpful if I cite a couple of theoretical perspectives here. And I've tried to do it in the first part in a chronological order. So, the first author's work goes back to 1995, and then I'll step it up from there to show you also how in higher education our minds have shifted as far as this is concerned and where we actually should be now. So the first part is really dealing, therefore, with conceptions of teaching. In other words, our orientations as higher education teachers towards curriculum. So Barr and Tag talks about a paradigm shift in a seminal article that they wrote in 1995. And it is about, they asked the question, is a university an institution of higher learning mainly to provide instruction, in other words, transmission of knowledge, or is it an institution to provide construction, production of learning, construction of knowledge? And here they make the distinction between a teacher-centered paradigm associated with instruction and a student-centered paradigm associated then with construction. So what do you think? I mean, what currently are we predominantly doing at CPUT? Are we trapped more in a teacher-centered paradigm still? Are we still predominantly fixed on subject content, imparting of information to students, filling them up in the class as much as we can with knowledge? Or are we spending the time in the class more effectively so that it can be about producing and it can be about construction of knowledge? So Barentag therefore has 6, and I think Barbara has handed this out to you, and I've summarized this for you. There are 6 dimensions where they distinguish between the instruction paradigm and what they call the learning paradigm or the construction paradigm. The first one has to do with mission and purpose. And here they ask the question about, is in the instruction paradigm, for example, the focus then is very much just on instruction. So it's about how well are you teaching. So the focus is on the actual teaching strategies also to a certain extent. And to what extent are you using your teaching strategies to actually impart the knowledge? Instead of shifting the focus away from instruction to be more student-centered, to be aware of the students who are, in fact, sitting in your class. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing, I think, in the mission and purpose of what we need to say, ask ourselves also as an institution. Because these are statements that you often see in the strategic objectives, in the strategic vision of the institution. And to what extent, therefore, are we making that real? We're saying these things in our strategic objectives. Yes, we want to be more student-centered, but yet, are we actually making that real? The next dimension that I looked at is the issue of criteria for success. So are we looking at, are we fixed on pass rates, throughput rates? Is that our measure of success? Or is the actual measure of success that we should rather be looking at the actual student outcomes? What actually are students leaving with? What are they able to do with the knowledge and the skills that they actually acquired at the institution? And do we have effective ways of measuring that? Because currently, we're very much fixed on the instruction paradigm in terms of our criteria for success. There are hardly conversations, even in Senate Teaching and Learning Committee meetings, on student outcomes. So I'm just assuming, therefore, that that very often would probably be happening in faculties and departments as well, where the conversation is therefore not that much on the actual outcomes that students have achieved through the learning. Then they refer to teaching learning strategies. And here they make the distinction in the instruction paradigm where we see the curriculum to be discrete, isolated units of learning. And that it is all about fostering an organizational structure, and we're very fixed on timetables and organizational issues, and we operate in these silos as academic departments. We're very, very defensive about what we do. We're not opening up the space to have conversations with academics from other departments who might be able to make a very valuable contribution to our programs. And then contrasting that with the learning paradigm where they say the focus should be on blurring of these boundaries, of negotiating curriculum content, of ensuring that there is constant and useful feedback being given also in terms of the organizational structure, but more importantly in terms of institutional and student performance. Therefore, adopting also a different way of how we measure the success. The next dimension that they focus on is about learning theory, where they contrast learning theory in terms of delivery of chunks of knowledge in comparison to a holistic approach to learning, where the focus is on the actual the ontological perspective on the being, the becoming of the student within this higher education space, instead of therefore being trapped in this imparting of knowledge and just focusing therefore on subject content. Why is this a problem currently? Because we often see in subject learning, subject guides, and then in these subject templates that are accompanying the HEQC submissions, that people tend to, when you say, describe this subject, I thought the description of a subject should be an easy thing for an academic to do. But I've discovered that people fall into this trap of listing topics. What does that say about our understanding then of that subject? If it is just about this topic I need to cover, that topic I need to cover, that topic I need to cover, is that not chunks of information? And I need to just work through these different chunks of information and then I've done my job. All right, instead of looking at what are students actually able to do with this information, and shifting the focus therefore towards that. So there's this wonderful quote which I'd like to read to you of Chickering and Gamson of 1987 that says, "Learning is not a spectator sport." Okay, students do not learn much just by sitting in classes and listening to teachers memorizing pre-packaged assignments and spitting out answers. They must talk about what they're learning, write about it, relate to past experiences, and apply to their daily lives. They must take what they learn, they must make what they've learned part of themselves. And I think that really that says it all. And it really is a wake-up call for us to think about what it is we do and how we go about what we do. The last two dimensions, nature of the roles, and here distinguishing therefore between imparting of information and facilitating learning, with a focus therefore on maximizing student effort, maximizing student engagement in the learning process. And then lastly, on productivity and funding, where the measures that we use to actually measure our effectiveness is very much on student-staff ratios, very much on how effectively are we using our time in the curriculum, in terms of the timetable, instead of actually looking at the hours that students spend in class, what actually happens in that time. So it's fine to say so many hours have been assigned to the subject, but what actually happens in that time is really the crux of the matter. So I think that we can take some messages from this, and you can read more of it. It's an interesting article, but like I also said, this is dating back a little while. I'm going to take questions in a little while. I'm just going to move on for the interest of time. So what I want to show you now is that the relationship, there's a direct relationship here between how we think of curriculum, our role as teachers, and how students think about it. And this was done effectively by Prosser and Trickwell already in 2006, where you can see the students' line and their perception of the content, their approach to learning, and the outcomes of their learning as the top line, and the bottom line, the teacher's perception of the context, their approach to teaching, and then the outcome of their teaching. And there's a direct relationship here being tied together with what happens actually in the curriculum. So what then came from this is that all of this research pointed that people in terms of teaching have more or less 7 different conceptions. The first 3 is more quantitative in nature, it's more transmission, it's more students, it's more teacher-centered. It's about imparting information, transmitting of knowledge, and to some extent facilitating learning. Where the last 4 from Cornell in 2007 indicates that it's about changing students' conceptions, it's about supporting student learning, negotiating meaning, and encouraging knowledge creation. So that tells us that we can basically group these 2 as you can see, going back to bar and tag into instruction and construction. But yet, I want to take the conversation a little further. So I want to link to the work of Light, Cox and Calkins in 2009. And you will see that Barbara will do the handout. I'll come back to the curriculum conceptions just now, but Barbara, you can hand it out, yeah. Okay, so what we see here is different from bar and tag, where we have the distinction between the instruction and the construction paradigm. We also sit now with teacher-centered, student-focused, and learning-focused. So it raises the question, what then is the difference between a student-focused curriculum and a learning-focused curriculum? And this is an important question, especially if we're going to be using our curriculum design model, where we want to promote a learning-focused curriculum. So what you can see on the screen here as a summary is that from a student perspective, in terms of the student learning perspective, in terms of the teacher-focused curriculum, the student learning is not the teacher's concern. Okay, it's about, I walk in the class, I know it all, I will deliver, whether you're there or not my problem, but I've done my duty. It's that kind of attitude. Where many of our staff, and I'll show you data from CPUT just now, many of our staff have moved beyond that. They've moved beyond the teacher-focused curriculum. They're aware of the students who are sitting in their classes. They're acknowledging the fact that many of these students are underprepared coming into higher education. And therefore what they have done is they have started to bring in strategies to help students in the class to encourage active learning. So the curriculum conception has shifted, therefore, towards being more student-centered. The reality is we need to shift it further than that. We need to shift it further towards a learning-centered approach, where the focus is really on the conceptual development of the student. The student being actively engaged, but asking more of the why questions than asking the kind of what questions. So therefore, really focusing on changing their conceptual understanding of whatever the topic is about. And here you can see, therefore, the shift if you look at from the student learning, the relationship of the student's relationship to the course content, what actually happens from the teaching perspective, and then the focus of good teaching. And this is where we're working towards, which therefore means we sit here with a disparity in terms of if this is what we say we should be doing, and this is what we present to the CHE in our subject information templates, we have a problem. Okay, and that's what we need to grapple with in this course. How do we overcome this challenge? Okay, so if we then move on to the theoretical perspectives, and here the theoretical perspectives of curriculum. We sent out the article for you on Fraser and Bosanquet, 2006, and they argue how we conceive of curriculum and curriculum making is important, because our conceptions and ways of reasoning about curriculum reflect and shape how we see, think, and talk about, study, and act on the education made available to our students. So it all starts with our mindset. Starts with how we approach this. Are we approaching this as a tick box exercise of I've covered this topic, I've covered this topic, I've got this down in the template? Or are we thinking about this from a different perspective about what is the actual learning that students need to engage in? What is the kind of conceptual change we want to bring about with this particular subject or with this program? So when we started with the curriculum renewal process at CPUT about 10 years ago, it was important for us to be aware of the fact that many of the staff at that point had no experience of curriculum. They've never been part of curriculum conception making processes. Okay? So they have not sat in discussions where curriculum was discussed, where a new program was developed. They were actually closed off from that because most of that happened within the convener system, and therefore it was senior staff or HODs who participated in that, and they sat in a situation where they were given the curriculum. So in a way, the curriculum was externally controlled. Okay? And so they came into curriculum making from the first conception there as a curriculum transmitter, and therefore got trapped also to some extent in a teacher-focused approach, because I'm here to transmit what was given to me as a curriculum. We now know that people have shifted, but where we need to shift towards is we need to actually shift towards an enactment approach, where we as higher education teachers become the curriculum creators. We are making the decisions of what should be in the curriculum. We need to ask then also the questions about why that should be in the curriculum. Why is it appropriate for this particular context? We should ask the questions about the sense of identity that we want students to develop through that curriculum then as well. And so therefore it requires us to adopt more of an holistic approach. So Fraser and Sonkwit has asked these questions in their research. What is your understanding of curriculum? What experiences have you had of curriculum change? What are some of the things you see impacting on curriculum? And they group that into 4 categories. And I think these 4 categories resonate well with what I've seen over the past 10 years in terms of curriculum discussions, curriculum documentation at CPUT. You have the staff members, okay, the A category. Those are the people who are only fixed on their subject. They see the curriculum as the subject they teach. The focus is on that individual unit of learning. They very often see subject content as king. They're very rigid in terms of their control and very protective of that territory as well, and they're in control. And very often, therefore, then, the students play a very passive role. Then you have a group of people who've shifted beyond that, and that's most certainly the case in terms of the CEOs and many other staff at the institution as well, where they've opened up the possibility of seeing the curriculum as the program in its totality, understanding that this subject is just part of a much bigger picture. And it's important for me to therefore have a conversation with my colleagues, because what I do in my subject will have bearing on what happens elsewhere in the program as well. And we need to therefore work far more collaboratively on this. They still have a tendency to be very protective of their territory, and therefore content still plays an important role, but yet they are opening themselves up to the possibility of starting to play a more active role. Then we have the curriculum as a student's experience of learning, where a lot of the staff are focusing on what is that experience of learning that students will leave with. And the curriculum here is then seen as a process that will enable student learning, and their focus very often is on what kinds of strategies can I build into my curriculum that will help students learn better. Okay? And many of us are there, that it is about those strategies. I want good pass rates, because that's what the institution expects of me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to teach students a couple of strategies so that they can learn well in my subject. I'm going to do a couple of exercises with them. I'm going to do this assignment, that assignment, because that I know, yes, will get them to engage. But is there really deep learning taking place? Is there really conceptual change? Or are we going through the motions? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. So ideally speaking, where we would like to be in terms of our conception of curriculum is curriculum as a dynamic and an interactive process. It means asking the questions of, the world is on fire. Having those uncomfortable conversations in class on topics that we sometimes also feel uncomfortable having amongst ourselves. Okay? It's having that confidence to know that when you stand in front of the class, you don't have to pretend that you know it all, because you actually don't. Okay? That's the reality of the world we live in. Okay? We cannot be experts in everything. And some of the questions we deal with in the world we live in now are in any case so big and so complex that there's no way that we can even pretend doing that. So it therefore means we need to build a different relationship with our students. We need to acknowledge their prior learning. We need to acknowledge their identity. We need to acknowledge who they are, what they are bringing in to the classroom, and then we need to start working with that. But it also then means in our curriculum conceptualization process, we need to be more aware of who these students are going to be before we start the design process. And we need to put effort in to actually acquire that information and not just thumbsuck it. We think it's going to be so-and-so coming from here, doing this, having been in industry for so long, wanting now to go on to a postgraduate diploma. Where is the real data? How did we go about? What credible methods did we use to actually gather this information? Or are we just making it up as we go along? So therefore, ideally speaking, we're moving towards a process orientation for curriculum. So therefore, we're moving away from templates, being fixed on what must be in a template, to a process of thinking, to a process of conceptualization, and hence therefore to the curriculum design model. So what you're seeing therefore is that there's a slide, there's a handout that Barbara is giving you, where I have given you the details of Fraser Bosanquet's conceptions of curriculum on the one hand, and the teaching orientations of Lightcox and Clarkins on the other hand. These handouts will be made available on Blackboard, but I knew that everybody for the first session might not have access to Blackboard yet. So from this point onwards, it's going to be electronic, but for today's session, we've decided to do both. The important thing is these handouts are given to you for a purpose. It's there to empower you also to take this into your academic department to go and have that conversation. So you can go and do the same exercise I've done with you, with your staff, and say, what do you see your role to be? What is your role in terms of curriculum? What is your role in terms of teaching? And to start the conversation there. And then to talk them through the conceptions of teaching and the conceptions of curriculum and how it's important for us, therefore, to shift our minds. So I want to just show you some of the data from, how much time do I still have? A little bit. Okay. Just want to show you some of the data. In 2012, Frederica and I did a little, very small scale project. We took subject guides from a particular faculty and we analyzed the subject guides, and we wanted to see to what extent are academics based on what they say in their subject guides. And the subject guide gives information about, yes, the details of the subject and the topics that will be covered and the sequencing in which the topics will be approached as well. But it also gives details about the assignments and the assessments that will be done, etc. So the data was actually startling, because my expectation was that even at that stage, there should be a lot more people on this side in terms of category D, where people are thinking more open-minded, there's more co-construction of knowledge taking place in the classroom. The reality is the data showed that a lot of the staff at that stage were still very much in category A and category B. Okay, I then, about 3 years later, repeated a similar exercise using a slightly different conceptual framework in applied design, and the results were almost the same. Okay, so it shows us, therefore, that a lot about why we're battling so much to get this right starts with our conceptions, the way we think about curriculum, the fact that we are still very much fixed, therefore, on subject content, on a product orientation to curriculum. So this is just a summary of the data where you can see that category A, the topics are selected very often according to the prescribed textbook. Chapter 1 is topic 1, chapter 2 is topic 2, it goes in that order, very fixed as far as that is concerned. And therefore, not only one subject we detected, there was a little shift towards a more learning-centered approach. We have written up this as an article, so if you're interested, I'm happy to share the article with any of you. So therefore, the relationship between conception of teaching and conception of curriculum. And what we are trying to promote is what is in the bottom here. We're trying to tell you that it's important to promote a conceptual change through a process of facilitation of students' construction of meaning, dialogical relationship aimed at developing students as critical beings to bring about change. Because we can't possibly think that by just imparting information to students, we are sending them out into a world of constant change, and things that will happen to them which we don't even have any idea about at this stage. That little bit of knowledge we're imparting is going to equip them for that. We need to equip them in a different way to think for themselves. Okay, and therefore the focus of the learning need to shift towards that, and not in terms of just merely being fixed on prescribed textbooks. So the challenge, therefore, I think, is for us also to make the shift, as like Cox and Kelkin says, towards being higher education teachers as reflective professionals. Because it then means that to apprehend their dynamic role as curriculum creators, educators must abandon the conviction that curriculum is an object, explicit, prescribed, and given. Regrettably, this way of characterizing curriculum can lead higher education teachers to think of themselves as technicians, whose realm only includes lesson plans, curriculum guides, outcomes, and tests, but excludes their own artistry and their students' curiosity from curriculum development and enactment. It also then means that these educators focus on discrete parts of curriculum and do not see the bigger picture. They may view themselves as employees controlled by the educational system and not as empowered professionals. Okay, so it's important for us, therefore, to take up this space, take up this challenge. We have a wonderful opportunity with new programs at this institution to actually do that. We must therefore not give our power away to national agencies who are only interested in a product-orientated approach to curriculum, because they're looking at it through the eyes of the templates that you are filling in. That's disempowering you as a higher education teacher. And hence, therefore, in this program, we are therefore going to guard against that as we go along. So the call to professionalism, therefore, is to open up the space, to acknowledge the context that we work in, to understand, therefore, that we're operating in an environment of substantial uncertainty and change, and to manage that change. That's really the challenge. That is what a reflective professional needs to do. You need to constantly be working at this, be aware of what you're doing in the classroom, what your student needs are, how you're presenting the body of knowledge to the students, and how, within the context of the institution, are you fully making use of the opportunities available to you while pushing students' mind beyond just the walls of the institution into a wider context, into the bigger world out there. Okay, we have spoken about the curriculum decision-making model. So just to once again show the model, I hope that the theoretical perspectives gives you an indication as to why, therefore, we have a learning-centered curriculum in the middle of in the center of the model, and not a student-centered curriculum. So, any questions? Let's have a quick discussion about this.
It's interesting. Sorry.
Sure.
I don't know if I would pose it as a question or as a comment. It was about the paradigms that we were discussing here. And it was the criteria for success, and where you focused on the learning paradigm, where the focus has to be on student learning outcomes. Now, going through everything and seeing the categories that each of us know by now that we fall into, obviously for each of us there would be a different student learning outcome, because of which we are falling in that category, because our focus, like you said, some of them have strategies, they focus and they want pass rate, because then they want to show that the students in my subject are doing exceedingly well. Whereas for some, they are in that mindset again, where they have been teaching things in a certain way, and it actually doesn't, or slightly makes a difference for them in terms of a student scoring, not scoring, failing, or passing. So I would actually say, is there any, or are there any number of examples that we as a higher education teacher would put down that, okay, this is what we need to expect in a learning-centered approach to be the student level outcomes, student learning outcomes?
Okay, I think that you must just distinguish here between what is meant there by student outcomes is not learning outcomes of a subject. It's also not exit level outcomes of a program. It's in the totality, in a more holistic context of what is higher education actually about. Okay, this program obviously contributing to that and positioning the student in a particular field, disciplinary field of study, and preparing the student therefore for the job out there in a bigger world. So that's what's meant by the student outcomes here. We shouldn't see that as learning outcomes and translate that to learning outcomes, because these should rather be graduate outcomes, okay, in a more holistic sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
okay.
Just a more comment, which is interesting at some of the orientation things that have been happening in the past few days, that they talk about being student-centered. Not just any one individual, I think it was just one person I heard say that, but it makes sense when you look at the learner-centered. But the understanding, I think, for many people is that student-centered means that interactive.
I think that the important thing here is learning-centered means the focus is on the learning process.
And not just on the student. Yeah.
Okay, of which obviously the student has to be part of that. You cannot be learning-centered without the student being a central part of that. But it moves away from the mere focus on strategies and activities, and, the students need to be engaged and active, to what really happens then. If students are engaged and active, is there really conceptual change taking place? Are the students really deeply thinking about these issues? Are they taking it beyond just what happens in the classroom? Are you challenging them in terms of the assignments you give them? The case studies you would give them? Are you challenging to think beyond just the obvious? Or are you just allowing them to go through the motions, and yes, they're active, and yes, there's a lot of activity going on, but the reality is that it's not contributing significantly to their critical being. That's the focus. The focus is on how is this contributing to their critical being as an individual, obviously within the career that they will be in later on, but more importantly, I think, as a citizen of this country, within the South African context, how are they perceiving that? That is not becomes just a kind of, in a way, selfish way of just looking at it from their own personal perspective. Okay.
Thank you.